Good morning. Appreciate you tuning in for this brief study of God's Word. We're going to be thinking today about Pharaoh. And when we think about Pharaoh, you probably think about maybe Moses and the Pharaoh that we read about in Exodus. But before we get to that Pharaoh, there was another Pharaoh in the book of Genesis in the life of Joseph, and he was a little better than the Pharaoh in Exodus. He was a good Pharaoh, I would suggest. And I wanted to come back and look at him. So come back to the book of Genesis, is where we're going to be looking at today. And we're going to start reading in Genesis chapter 41. I hope you had a good weekend. Appreciate you tuning in with us today. In Genesis chapter 41, we're going to pick up the account. Joseph currently, as of this verse, Joseph is in the dungeon. Remember, Potiphar's wife lied about him. We talked about Joseph last week, talked about overcoming. And anyway, Potiphar's wife had lied about Joseph. Joseph was in the dungeon. And even there, the Lord was with him. And he prospered, for lack of a better way of putting it, even there in the dungeon. But the butler and the baker had had those dreams. And of course, one of them was going to be given his old position back, the other one was going to lose his head. Joseph told the one who was going to get his old position back to please remember him, and he forgot. He ignored, frankly. He did not remember Joseph. But after a couple of years, Pharaoh has a dream, and that's chapter 41. Verse 5, he slept and dreamt a second time, and you have the heads of grain, the plump and good. The first one was the cows, some fat, some gaunt. But to get to, and just for time's sake, I want you to think about verse 8. It came to pass in the morning, this is talking about Pharaoh. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. And the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, and he's going to remember Joseph. And this is how Joseph is going to be brought to Pharaoh's presence, and then the account progresses. But I wanted to start simply with verse 8. It came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And I wanted you to just consider that that is a good quality, that he could be troubled. And there was something going on. And as you think about Pharaoh, and I understand he was, I don't think he believed in Jehovah. I don't think he worshiped Jehovah like the Jews did or anything like that. But sometimes when we think about Pharaoh, especially in Exodus, and certainly the pharaohs at that time, they believed that they were gods, and they believed they should be worshipped as God. And perhaps this one went down that road as well. But at the same time, he could be troubled. And sometimes, folks, as you think about it, they have such a seared conscience. They are so sure of themselves and so proud and so egotistical that nothing troubles them. Well, this Pharaoh's different. He could be troubled, and that's a good thing. He recognized it bothered him, these dreams that he was having, and he wanted the dreams interpreted because it was bothering him so much. You might just think about that is a good quality. If we feel that there is something amiss, if our conscience is bothering us, and something's just not sitting right, that's a good thing. Those are warning bells that are going off, and it's a good thing that this Pharaoh, that he could be troubled. You might consider it, but also as Joseph is brought to him, look over in chapter 41 at verse 38, a little bit later in the chapter. Chapter 41, verse 38, Joseph comes and he says, God gives interpretation, and Joseph was just an instrument of the Lord. But as Joseph gave the interpretation, verse 37, So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one discerning and wise as you. Now, the word God here, it's not the word Jehovah, it's just it's Elohim. So it's just the spirit of the gods. So, not to say he's a believer in Jehovah or anything like that, but at the same time, I do think to think about Pharaoh, he recognized good and godly. He recognized now there's something different about Joseph and there's something different about his advice. When he says he calls his magicians, he calls all them, and Joseph is different, and he recognizes that. And in that, there's a good quality to Pharaoh that he recognizes good and godly wisdom, and there's something to be said about that. That shows how this Pharaoh is actually different than the Pharaoh that we read about in Exodus. I would also suggest another thing about him. He rejoices at others' good. And I want you to come back to the account and a little bit later in chapter 47. And this is to look over in chapter 47. Let's see. Let's look. Oh, pardon me. I got a little too far ahead of myself. Chapter 45. Chapter 45. And let's look at verse 14, just to kind of give you an idea where we are. Then he, talking about Joseph, fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. Now the report of it was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brothers have come. So it pleased Pharaoh and his servants well. Think about Pharaoh, that he could rejoice at others' good. The verse that comes to mind is, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Pharaoh, something good had happened to Joseph. And Joseph had been a blessing to Pharaoh and to everybody else as well. But something good is happening in Joseph's life, and it pleased Pharaoh. He was able to rejoice at others' blessings. He was able to rejoice at others' good. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people never do that. They're too selfish and they're too caught up in themselves to ever rejoice when others rejoice. Pharaoh rejoiced as Joseph and the family, at least the father and Benjamin, as they rejoiced. But he was able to rejoice at others' good. You might consider it. A little bit later in chapter 47 now. Chapter 47, as all the family is going to come down to Egypt. Chapter 47, verse 6, this is Pharaoh speaking to Joseph. Verse 5, your father and your brothers have come to you. Verse 6, the land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. To think about, as Pharaoh says, dwell in the best of the land. And to think about Pharaoh and to think about how good he was, just think about the fact that he could be generous. He says, take the best of the land. Joseph had been such a blessing. And for Pharaoh, for this individual, and for all the power that Pharaoh had, and for these folks, and you might think about, remember what Potiphar's wife says. What Potiphar's wife, she says, oh, this Hebrew has come. To think about it, they had some knowledge of, apparently, the Hebrews, as it was. There weren't that many of them, but they had some knowledge of them on some level, apparently. But to Pharaoh, Pharaoh says, when the family comes down, you can have the best land. Take Goshen. And that's why they end up there. Pharaoh could be generous. Look back in the account, just as a side point. Joseph, verse 7, Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, How old are you? Jacob said to Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers and the days of their pilgrimage. And once again, verse 10, So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. You might think about it. It's an interesting account. When we think about Pharaoh, we usually think about Exodus Pharaoh. Well, before that Pharaoh, you have a good Pharaoh here in Genesis, as Jacob blesses him. It's an interesting account. Just a little bit of our daily bread. Appreciate you tuning in today. Hope you have a good day as the week gets going. Appreciate you tuning in. Hope you tune in tomorrow for another study from God's Word. Thanks for being with us this morning.